and a pioneer in thought and action. His success with the 2G scam is a culmination of a lifelong record as an independent-minded politician, an independent-minded academic, and an independent-minded economic thinker. And these are some of the things that we tend to forget in the events that have happened very recently. I have pieced together some vignettes from his life that would underline exactly this. If he was not sitting here, Dr. Swamy would have been a brilliant academic, because he started his career with a PhD from Harvard in economics in 1965 when he was barely 26 under Simon Kuznets, subsequently a Nobel laureate. He taught at Harvard till 1969 when Amartya Sen sought him for a position in the Delhi School of Economics. He accepted the offer, but when he arrived, he found his appointment cancelled. One of the first of the many battles he started. Why? Because with strong views that India must have nuclear capabilities and pro-market policies. This was in 1969, when socialism and communism were at their peak, when banks and insurance companies were nationalized, license Raj was killing the consumer more than they were killing the businessman, and that's our view, and 90% of income level above a certain level was being confiscated by the government through so-called taxes. Both his so-called right-wing views on the nuclear option and pro-market policies became conventional wisdom much later, that is decades later. Dr. Swamy was ahead of the time with his views, unafraid to express them and stuck to them and paid a price for it. Since the socialist-controlled Delhi schools shunned him, Swamy moved to the Indian Institute of Technology, but he was more than a professor there, turning up at hostels to speak on domestic policies and international issues with students, articulating his so-called right-wing views. At that stage itself, he published what is called a Swadeshi plan. And the plan argued quite remarkably, with great foresight, that India did not need foreign aid. This was the time when we were dependent on foreign aid, which many of the youngsters don't remember. If it adopted market-friendly alternative to this great 5-year plan which was thrust upon us by the Fabian socialists of Nehru and the other ilk, which would fetch us 10% growth at that time and help us become an exporter of agricultural goods at a time when Indian farmers were really leading a hand-to-mouth existence. So I wanted to bring out all of these things because we think of him only as a crusader on the 2G scam case. This was again an example of clear, independent thinking, nationalist, and yet blending the market-driven policies of the West that have helped them get ahead. And these policies, these thought processes that he articulated, but decades before such thinking, became eventually the mainstream, not just all over the world, but also in India. Even as India struggled with its Hindu rate of growth at 3.5%, these ideas were ridiculed. It was worse actually, personally for him, because it was against the dominant ideology of the dominant party at that time. In March 1970, during a parliament debate on the budget, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi mentioned Dr. Swamy by name and dismissed him as Santa Claus with unrealistic ideas. He persisted with his ideas until, on a particular day in December 1972, just a couple of years after he had joined IIT, he was sacked from IIT with effect on a given day at 5 p.m. with a letter that was delivered to him at 5:15. His wife, who taught mathematics, was also sacked. Swamy took IIT court, whereas, as you know, that's what he does very well, eventually winning his case in the Supreme Court in 1991. He rejoined as a professor for one day and then resigned. And I'm not sure whether this is true, but we gather that he still has a case pending against IIT for a claim of salary arrears from 1972 to 91 period, which he won with 18%. By the mid-70s, the decades of oppressive and backward economic policies that India followed since independence was beginning to take its toll, and winds of change were blowing. Dr. Swamy became very politically involved. He joined the Jayaprakash Narayan Sarvodaya movement, which was ideological and political foundation for the Janata Party later. Dr. Swamy entered the Rajya Sabha in 1974. In 75, Mrs. Gandhi declared emergency and Dr. Swamy faced arrest. Disguised as a Sikh, he escaped to Chennai, Sri Lanka, and then to the United States, where he became a spokesperson for the India's opposition and also took up visiting professor assignment at Harvard again. On 10th August 1976 was the opening day of the monsoon session of the parliament. Dr. Swamy had been away from the parliament for 6 months and could have lost his seat for non-attendance. So he returned, entered the parliament, remember the arrest warrant was still on, and took his seat. With the chairman of the House, then Vice President V.D. Jatti, was making obituary references, Dr. Swamy got up and said, "I have a point of order." There's no obituary reference here for democracy. It has also died. The speaker was rattled. He asked members to stand in silence for those notables who had died recently. With the rest of the house standing in silence, Dr. Swamy ran out, having registered his presence. Of course, the security was minimal those days. After leaving the parliament, he changed to kurta and put on a kada, resembling a youth congress leader. Sanjay Gandhi public meeting had just got over, and he joined a procession moving towards the railway station. He boarded a train to Mathura and later crossed over to Nepal and flew from there to Bangkok and to the US. How did he do this? How the foreign governments honored his cancelled passport is a mystery to all of us. Someday, Dr. Swamy should reveal to us through an autobiography. And as we were discussing just a little while ago, there's somebody, a well-wisher, a friend of Money Life Foundation, Rajiv Shah, who's right here, and Dr. Swamy apparently had stayed in his house in Satara during the same period during emergency, where he was taking shelters at different places. Thank you, Rajiv, for sheltering Dr. Swamy at that time. Dr. Swamy held important positions as a minister and planning commission member under the Janata government, and again in 1991 in the Chandrasekhar government. In November 1978, he was a member of the group of eminent persons called to prepare a report for the United Nations on cooperation and agreement between developing countries. He simplified trade procedures and formulated a new export strategy, which became the forerunner of trade reforms, which was adopted subsequently by all countries. In one of the most intriguing episodes of Indian politics at that time, in 1994, he was appointed the chairman of the Commission on Labour Standards and International Trade by Narasimha Rao. It was a cabinet rank position which Dr. Swamy held as an opposition party member and in a Congress government, and was often being invited to cabinet meetings. This was the first time something like this has happened in India. But the more interesting part of this episode was that the commission was placed under the Commerce Ministry. And guess who was the Minister of State reporting to Dr. Swamy as a Minister of State for Commerce? A certain gentleman called Mr. P. Chidambaram. By the way, liberalization measures that Narasimha Rao and Dr. Manmohan Singh initiated in 1991 were drawn up in 1990 when Chandrasekhar was the Prime Minister and Dr. Singh was the advisor. Indeed, Dr. Manmohan Singh recently stated that Dr. Swamy was the first to envisage and articulate the need for extensive reforms, economic reforms that we've seen subsequently in India. With a life as colorful as this, there are many interesting stories from Dr. Swamy's life, but I will end with just a couple of short points. As part of his forward thinking, Dr. Swamy advocated normalizing India's relationship with Israel and China way back in the 1970s. In 1982, he became the first Indian political leader to visit Israel, meeting top Israeli leaders. India and Israel subsequently opened embassies in each other's countries in 1992. Dr. Swamy was a decade ahead of this actual event. In 1981, he persuaded Deng Xiaoping to open the Kailash Mansarovar in Tibet to Hindu pilgrims from India, and became the first Indian to visit Kailash on Mansarovar after the reopening. Having joined politics, Dr. Swamy would have been a distinguished academic, as I mentioned, especially since he was a China expert from the beginning, and China, as you know, is absolutely hot now. Dr. Swamy has argued throughout the 70s that China's data of economic progress under Mao was grossly exaggerated. He was proved right in a pretty funny way. In 1980, China asked World Bank for concessional aid. The World Bank told China, but you are not entitled to aid because according to your data, your per capita GDP is much higher than the threshold of countries which qualify for concessional aid. The Chinese argued all that data is all wrong, it was all Mao era exaggeration. Please read Subramanian Swamy's research on China. Coming back to today's theme, a big lesson for those who want change is that you can get a lot done within the system. Dr. Swamy has done something that seems absolutely impossible otherwise, actually getting a government decision involving tens of thousands of crores, including illegal payoffs, scrapped. Most importantly, has done what can be called as an inside job, using available tools such as a code of law. Those who talked of supremacy of legislature and parliament in the recent agitation of Anna Hazare should have their mouth absolutely shut now. One last point, Dr. Swamy has always held controversial views, especially on religion. Some people call him a Hindu bigot, but the facts are as follows. His wife is a Parsi, his brother-in-law is a Jew, his son-in-law is a Muslim, and his sister-in-law a Christian. With these words, I will now request Dr. Subramanian Swamy a man of the year and a man of the decade who single-handedly has done more for successfully exposing corruption than anyone else in recent memory, to please address us this morning. After all, it's not very often that we get a full Harvard tenured professor as our politician, and we should make the best of it. None other than Dr. Subramanian Swamy.
Thank you, Mr. Basu. I hope I'm able to live up to the build-up you have given. I think you must be CIA to know all these details. हाँ, करूँगा. आप सवाल पूछिए हिंदी में मैं जवाब दूँगा. But any adulterate भाषण तो मैं दे नहीं सकता. First of all, I'd like to congratulate Sucheta Dalal, who people had warned me is a financial terrorist, but then she only attacks those who are corrupt. For her second anniversary in this Money Light Foundation, very active, she writes very well, written for a long time. And therefore she qualifies as a genuine intellectual, not the ones that you normally see who are always on the side of the government. I would like to divide my topic today in three parts. Why is 2G so important? Two, what are the ramifications or implications that flow out of 2G? And three, what is it that we can do to see such things don't happen in the future? Today, we can boast of a very high rate of growth, leave aside the last 2 years. But we can also recognize the fact that our rank in the Transparency Index on corrupt nations has been falling steadily. And now out of 124 countries, our rank is 95. And we are just a little ahead of Pakistan. That's no satisfaction. And we are way below all others who are no better than us in economic development. We didn't have a reputation for being corrupt. 1600 years ago, Parsian came from China, and he recorded that the one thing that struck him about India was the people were so honest. He said people go out in the night without locking their houses, which he has not seen anywhere else. And he said if you by chance, by mistake, left anything behind on your travel, the people in India would hunt you down and give it back to you. And this is reaffirmed again by Yuan Chang, who came in 1100 AD. And then Vasco da Gama, Mark Twain, till about 300, 400 years ago. This was the general report of whoever visited India. Then suddenly, with the looting done during the East India Company period and the active promotion of bribery to get the public to comply, corruption began to take root in this country. And we expected in 1947, after we won the freedom struggle led by Mahatma Gandhi, who had the highest moral authority of all politicians of that century, that after 47 we would follow policies by which corruption would be minimized. But unfortunately, Mahatma Gandhi didn't remain. He was assassinated. Sardar Patel, another very strict disciplinarian, died in 1950. And Jawaharlal Nehru, while personally perhaps honest, had a tolerant view to colleagues who supported him but were corrupt. Krishna Menon, K.D. Malaviya, Ravi Ahmed Kidwai, number of them were known to be corrupt, but Nehru, because they supported him, defended them. And Krishna Menon was the most outrageous example of that. But more than that, one of the worst things that happened to us after 47 was the adoption of the Soviet economic model. This economic model brought into existence what is called as a quota license Raj, where licenses were at high premium and a new group of people came, they were the touts, who could get you licenses, and sometimes if you get the license you could sell it in the black market and make more profit than if you were actually use that license. And the license quota Raj laid the foundation for our corruption. And this went on, increasing as time went by. And after economic reform, I would have assumed that this corruption would go down. But a cultural change has taken place with globalization, which has now planted the seed of greed in all of us. And much of our problems today in corruption arises out of greed, that money can buy everything. This is not our tradition. Because our tradition, in fact, symbolized by Mahatma Gandhi, and was brought home to me when I first went as a student to get my PhD at Harvard. And my American colleagues said to me, how is it that you people of India followed Mahatma Gandhi? So I said, why? What's wrong with that? So one of the American students told me, because he's not even properly dressed, how can you follow